Fiona Carrington sat in the conference room, her eyes gleaming with anticipation as she listened to the news about the upcoming guest on her show. Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood legend, but also a symbol of conservative values that she and her audience loved to mock. This wouldn't just be an interview, it would be a battle. A battle she was certain she would win. The room buzzed with ideas. We could start with the clip of him talking to the empty chair back in 2012, one producer suggested, setting off a wave of laughter. Fiona smirked, already envisioning her audience cheering as she tore Clint apart with her sharp, biting commentary. Legend or not, he was too old, too outdated. Meanwhile, in Carmel, California, Clint Eastwood sipped his morning coffee, the invitation letter resting in his hand as if it were of little concern. "Fiona Carrington?" he muttered, scanning the name with mild indifference. Next to him, Jack, his longtime assistant, couldn't hide his concern. "Are you sure you want to do this? She won't play fair, Clint." Clint smirked, a knowing half-smile forming on his weathered face. "Jack, if I worried about confrontations, I wouldn't have survived Hollywood for this long." Jack sighed. "You know she's going to attack you, your politics, your career, even your age." Clint set his cup down, gazing out the window at the rolling hills stretching into the horizon. His voice was deep, reflective. "Sometimes it's not about winning or losing, it's about showing up and speaking the truth." Jack had no response. He knew Clint had never shied away from a fight, not because he sought conflict, but because he believed in standing firm. The man had spent decades facing critics, cultural shifts, and younger generations constantly trying to dismiss the values he upheld. And yet, through it all, he remained unshaken. The decision was made. Clint Eastwood would face Fiona Carrington, not to argue, not to win a debate, but simply to speak his truth. While Fiona and her team eagerly prepared for their media knockout punch, Clint simply went about his day, unbothered by the storm brewing ahead. The set of late-night Spotlight gleamed under the bright studio lights, the audience buzzing with excitement for the much-hyped showdown. Fiona Carrington strode onto the stage with confidence radiating from her every step, flashing a sharp, knowing smile as she waved to the crowd. Outside, millions were tuning in, expecting an unfiltered, brutal takedown. Backstage, Clint Eastwood walked slowly down the corridor, his presence calm against the high-strung energy surrounding him. Jack shadowed him closely, gripping his phone, eyes darting between the screen and the studio entrance. "The audience is all hers," Jack murmured. "She won't let you speak." Clint merely chuckled, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Let's see about that." Clint merely smirked. "You worry too much, Jack. It's just a conversation." But Jack couldn't be as calm as he was. He had seen how Fiona systematically dismantled conservative politicians, actors, and business leaders with sharp wit and relentless mockery. She had no qualms about interrupting, twisting words, or hammering on weak points until her guests were left speechless. She didn't play fair. She played to win. Meanwhile, on stage, Fiona Carrington launched into her opening monologue, pacing around her desk as she worked the crowd with her razor-sharp humor. "Tonight, we have a very special guest, a Hollywood legend, a relic of a bygone era, and a man who just can't seem to let go of the spotlight even when the times have clearly moved past him." The audience erupted into laughter, some applauding in agreement. Fiona continued, her voice brimming with energy and sarcasm. "Clint Eastwood, a man who can terrify an entire town with just a stare but somehow can't stop the younger generation from laughing at his outdated views. Let's give him a big round of applause." Cheers, mixed with a few whistles, filled the studio as Clint walked onto the stage. But unlike the chaos around him, he remained unshaken, composed, and completely unfazed. Fiona extended her hand, her eyes sparkling with amusement as she greeted him. "Such a pleasure to have you here, Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice sweet but laced with an unmistakable edge. Clint took her hand in a firm but measured handshake, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "Thank you for the invitation, Fiona," he responded, his deep voice slow and steady. I always appreciate an interesting conversation. Fiona raised an eyebrow, then glanced at the audience, as if signaling that they were about to witness a ruthless showdown. She had no idea tonight wouldn't go the way she expected. Fiona leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with calculated excitement. This was the moment she had been waiting for, to go head-to-head with a legend she believed was past his time. She smiled, a sharp, knowing smile that past guests had learned to fear, a signal that the attack was about to begin. "Clint," Fiona began, her voice honeyed but tinged with mockery, "you've had an incredible career, from westerns to iconic tough guy roles. But be honest, do you ever look back and think of yourself as a relic of a bygone era, a generation that now exists only as a memory?" The audience gasped and chuckled, with scattered applause echoing through the studio. Fiona had thrown down the gauntlet. Clint didn't respond immediately. He simply tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk crossing his face as if the question was something he had heard many times before. Folding his arms, he looked directly at Fiona, his eyes seasoned yet still sharp. "My generation has passed?" Clint repeated, his voice steady. "You're right, Fiona. But let me ask you, if not for that generation, would you be sitting here today?" Fiona raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting that response. Clint continued, his voice strong but composed. "We were the generation that built the foundation of this industry, the foundation of the freedom you now enjoy to say whatever you want on television without fear of censorship. We worked, we fought, and we created a country where you can stand here and mock those who came before you without consequence." The audience fell silent. Some began to think, the laughter from earlier fading into slow, thoughtful nods. But Fiona wasn't one to be easily defeated. She let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "That's a great speech, Clint," she replied. "But let's not forget that the world is changing. Outdated values, old ways of thinking, they're being replaced by something more progressive. I'm not saying the past doesn't matter, but maybe it's time we look forward instead of clinging to what once was." This time Clint chuckled softly, not a condescending laugh, but one of understanding. "Looking forward doesn't mean forgetting what built the foundation." He leaned in slightly. "Do you know why I'm still here at this age, sitting in front of you?" Fiona crossed her arms. "To prove that you still can?" Clint shook his head. "No," he said slowly. "Because the values you call outdated, perseverance, integrity, hard work, never expire. And I'm here because I believe that no matter how much the world changes, those things will always be the foundation of any generation." The studio went quiet. A few audience members exchanged glances, uncertain about what they had just witnessed. Fiona could feel the atmosphere in the room shifting, but she wasn't ready to back down. She leaned forward on the desk, her eyes burning with intensity. "Then tell me, Clint," she challenged, "if you believe those values still matter, do you think you can survive in today's world? A world where people like you are often pushed to the sidelines?" Clint studied her, his eyes deep, as if he wasn't just evaluating her question, but the person asking it. Then he gave a slow nod. "I don't just think I can survive. I have, and I am." And in that moment it was Fiona who was put on the defensive. The atmosphere in the studio grew tense. Fiona, always the one in control, was for the first time sensing that the game wasn't entirely in her hands. She was used to watching her guests stumble under the weight of her sharp questions. But Clint was different. He didn't seem threatened, he wasn't defensive, and in fact he was leading the conversation. Fiona took a deep breath, regaining her confidence. She leaned forward, her eyes flashing with a calculated challenge. "Surviving is one thing, Clint, but adapting is another," she said, her voice laced with implication. "You can say that your old-fashioned values still hold weight, but look at how far the world has progressed. Society is changing, and outdated ways of thinking no longer have a place. Maybe you're still here, but are you still relevant?" The audience gasped and murmured. It was a pointed question designed to provoke. But Clint remained unshaken. He met Fiona's gaze, not with defensiveness, but with a calm authority that was far more powerful. "Relevant," Clint repeated, as if tasting the word. "You mean relevant in a world that changes overnight, where people's worth is measured by a few lines on social media, where honor has been replaced by temporary fame?" He paused, his eyes sweeping across the audience. "I may not fit into your world, Fiona, but I don't see that as a tragedy." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. No one had expected that answer. Fiona smirked, feeling a rare sense of being challenged in a way she wasn't used to. "Are you saying modern thinking is wrong? That my generation doesn't know what's right?" she asked, pushing forward. Clint shook his head, his voice deep and firm. "No, I'm saying that past generations have learned hard-earned lessons. Lessons that too many young people today are rushing to forget." He leaned back in his chair, never breaking eye contact. "I've lived through times when the world seemed like it was on the verge of collapse. Wars, economic crises, fights for justice and rights. My generation didn't just talk about change. We acted. We understood that change needs a foundation, not just empty slogans." For the first time, Fiona felt like she was the one being questioned. She blinked, but quickly recovered her composure. "That's impressive, Clint," she said, her tone laced with sarcasm. "But maybe you haven't realized that we don't need lessons from your generation anymore. We're building our own future, one that isn't bound by outdated ideas." Clint smiled, not the smile of a man cornered, but of a man who had already seen through everything. "Fiona," he said slowly, "do you believe history is something you can throw away? That the lessons of the past lose their value just because they don't fit the story you're trying to tell?" Fiona opened her mouth to respond, but Clint continued, not giving her the chance. "You say your generation is building the future. I believe that. But have you ever stopped to ask what past generations had to do to give you that opportunity?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying more weight. "I don't need you to agree with me, Fiona. But I'll remind you of one thing. If you truly want to change the world, don't be so quick to tear everything down before you understand its value." The studio fell into silence. No more laughter, no more sarcastic applause. For the first time in her career, Fiona Carrington didn't have an immediate comeback. The air in the studio shifted. Fiona Carrington, the queen of sharp-witted debates, didn't rush to counter. She looked at Clint Eastwood, the man who had faced decades of challenges, lived through history's most turbulent moments, and realized that he wasn't just a relic of the past. He was a witness to history, someone who had built the foundation her generation now stood upon. The audience recognized the shift too. At first they had come expecting a dramatic takedown, but now they sat in thoughtful silence, listening, reflecting. They no longer saw Clint Eastwood merely as a legendary actor or a conservative defending outdated values. They saw a man of experience, calm and wise, speaking truths they had never truly considered before. Fiona exhaled slowly, setting down the pen she had been twirling between her fingers. "You know what, Clint," she said, her tone, for the first time lacking sarcasm, "I never thought I'd say this, but I respect you." Clint tilted his head slightly, his eyes holding a hint of curiosity. "You respect me?" Fiona nodded. "I don't agree with a lot of your views, but I can't deny that you've lived through times I've only read about in history books. And you haven't just talked. You've acted, witnessed, and fought for what you believe in." Clint gave a small, knowing smile. "Thank you, Fiona. Respect doesn't mean agreement, it means listening. And that's the first step to truly understanding each other." The studio erupted into applause, not for a victory, but for a rare moment of connection between two generations. Fiona Carrington took a deep breath. The sharp edge in her voice had softened, replaced with something more genuine. "Clint," she said, her voice quieter than ever, "I've spent my career challenging people like you, but I realize now I've never actually listened." Clint Eastwood leaned back, his expression as calm as ever. "You're not the only one," he said. "We live in a world where everyone wants to talk but few want to listen. Funny, isn't it? The more ways we have to connect, the more divided we become." That statement left the entire studio in silence. Even Fiona's most loyal supporters, who had come expecting to cheer her on, couldn't deny the truth in Clint's words. This wasn't just a lesson about politics or generations. It was a lesson about humanity. Fiona nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting deep contemplation. "I think," she said, "for the first time in my career, I truly feel challenged. But not by an attack, by sincerity." Clint smiled, a warm, knowing smile, the kind that came from someone who had seen it all. Sometimes sincerity is stronger than any criticism. It doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to come at the right moment. A round of applause echoed through the studio, this time without sarcasm or mockery, but as a tribute to a rare moment, a moment where a debate didn't create more division, but instead inspired people to think. The weight of Clint Eastwood's words still lingered in the air. For the first time in her career, Fiona Carrington didn't rush to regain control of the conversation. She looked at the man in front of her, a legend, a symbol of resilience, and realized that he wasn't trying to defeat her in a debate. He was simply sharing a truth. And that truth had changed everything. Fiona let out a soft breath. "I came into this interview hoping to create a memorable moment," she admitted, her voice free of its usual sarcasm. "But I never expected to be the one walking away with a lesson." Clint nodded, a faint smile crossing his aged but unwavering face. "That's what real conversations should do," he said, "not to defeat someone, but to help us all understand the world, and ourselves a little better." The audience felt it too. No longer were they just waiting for witty remarks or sharp retorts. Now they were listening, not to argue, but to learn. Fiona smiled, a real, unguarded smile. For the first time that evening, she didn't feel the need to prove anything. "Clint," she asked, "if there was one thing you'd want to leave behind for future generations, just one thing, what would it be?" Clint sat up straight, his deep blue eyes gazing beyond the bright studio lights, as if looking at something far greater than the moment at hand. "Know when to stand up and know when to listen," he said. "Don't lose yourself just to fit in, and don't let the noise of the world make you forget the voice inside you." The words hung in the air, resonating with everyone in the room. This wasn't just advice, it was a legacy. A reminder that in a world where everyone is desperate to be heard, sometimes the greatest strength lies in quiet conviction, in holding firm to what is right. For the first time, Fiona Carrington had nothing to say. But for the first time, she truly understood. After Clint Eastwood's powerful words, the entire studio remained in silence. No more laughter, no more excitement over Fiona's sharp wit. Instead, there was a stillness, a quiet filled with contemplation, as if every person in the room had just been awakened by a simple but undeniable truth. Fiona Carrington sat there, no longer the sharp-tongued host who always had a rebuttal ready. For the first time in her career, she didn't feel the need to win. She just wanted to listen, to absorb every word from the man sitting across from her, not just a Hollywood legend, but a symbol of resilience and integrity. She let out a soft chuckle, slightly embarrassed but genuine. "You know, Clint, I've always believed that I was the one who could make guests rethink their views, make them question their own beliefs. But tonight, I'm the one who's changed." Clint looked at her, his expression devoid of any triumph, only understanding. "Fiona," he said slowly, "that's the mark of someone truly strong. Not the one who wins an argument, but the one who knows when to learn." A wave of applause rippled through the audience, not for a witty comeback, not for an intense debate, but for a rare moment of mutual respect. The people in that room no longer saw Clint Eastwood as just a veteran actor or a staunch conservative. They saw him as a man of unwavering principles, someone who had stood firm for decades in a world constantly shifting around him. Fiona glanced around, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. She knew this episode wouldn't just be a fleeting topic of discussion. It would become something far more significant, a conversation that carried weight in a world filled with noise and division. She turned her gaze back to Clint, not as a host facing off against her guest, but as a student looking to a teacher. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but sincere. "Thank you for reminding me that sometimes the most important thing isn't speaking well, it's listening well." Clint nodded, a faint but knowing smile appearing on his weathered face. "The world needs more conversations like this," he replied, "and you're someone who can make that happen." His words weren't a critique, nor were they a lesson, they were recognition. And in that moment, Fiona Carrington wasn't just a talk show host anymore. She became part of something greater. Someone who was willing to learn, willing to inspire, and most importantly, willing to listen. As the applause continued, Clint Eastwood rose from his chair, moving slowly but steadily, not just leaving a television set, but leaving behind an imprint that would not soon fade. There was no arrogance of a victor, no satisfaction of having dominated an argument. There was only the calm presence of a man who had stayed true to his values. Fiona sat still, her hands resting lightly on the table, her eyes following Clint as he walked away. She had never felt this way before. Throughout her career, she had believed that her job was to challenge, to provoke, even to make guests uncomfortable. But tonight she realized something far more important. Her job was also to listen and to learn. A conversation that echoed beyond the studio. In the days following the broadcast, the public response exploded across every platform, but unlike previous episodes of Late Night Spotlight, which usually sparked short-lived debates over Fiona's sharpest jabs, this time the conversation wasn't about her, it was about Clint. Clint Eastwood, the master of composure. A lesson in integrity in an age of noise. When wisdom doesn't need to raise its voice. Fiona scrolled through countless comments, analyses, and video clips from the interview. People who once mocked Clint for his views were now sharing his words with newfound respect. Young audiences, who had never paid much attention to him, were now quoting his insights as guiding principles. One comment made her pause for a long time. "I used to think Clint Eastwood was just an old actor with outdated ideas. But after this interview, I realized that integrity and conviction never go out of style." Fiona sighed, her eyes still fixed on the screen. She wasn't the only one who had changed. A few days later, she made an unusual decision: to write a personal reflection. Not to justify, not to defend herself, but to express a truth she had come to understand. "I used to believe that my strength lay in my sharpness, in my ability to debate. But Clint Eastwood taught me that sometimes true strength lies in quiet resolve, in standing firm in your values without shouting, without overpowering others. Thank you not just for the legendary films, but for an even greater lesson on integrity and patience." The post quickly became one of her most shared and commented on reflections. But the biggest surprise wasn't the likes or shares. It was a private message from Clint himself. "You did well. Keep listening, keep learning. That's how we all get better." Fiona smiled. Not everyone gets to learn a lesson like this from a living legend. And she knew this wasn't the battle she had once envisioned. This was something far more lasting, a legacy of respect, of learning, and of inspiration. In today's society, where debates often turn into emotional and prejudiced confrontations, the conversation between Clint Eastwood and Fiona Carrington serves as a powerful reminder of the value of listening and sincere dialogue. Fiona entered the interview with the mindset of a victor, believing that her sharp wit and strong opinions would overpower Clint. But what she didn't expect was that Clint's calm demeanor, experience, and profound words would ultimately change her. This proves an important truth. Sometimes victory doesn't come from rigidity or argument, but from the ability to listen, learn, and accept reality. In our daily lives, we often fall into the trap of speaking without truly listening. We argue to win, not to understand. But the world is not limited to a single perspective, and true growth happens when we dare to admit that we might be wrong and that we can learn from others. A piece of advice for everyone in this noisy era: listen more, speak less, and don't be afraid to change your perspective when faced with the truth, because sometimes it is in the moments of silence and learning that we achieve our greatest victories.